What is classical Christian education? And how do I talk about it? Welcome to Volume 4 of Classical Clips, ladies and gentlemen. Let's first start with some attempts at giving some neat and tidy definitions. I said it was not really possible to do this, but we're going to give it a go anyway. So the first thing is to maybe understand classical education as the kind of education that everybody would have had up until about 150 years ago. You didn't actually need the word classical in front of the word education to define what it actually was. Every education was classical, literally, by means of its curriculum, and often its pedagogy. That means how the methods and approaches to teaching. In addition, the core of your study was rooted in a tradition that had been handed on. Classical languages like Latin and Greek were kind of at the center. They always were part of the curriculum. Even Shakespeare studied Latin. Maybe not as much Greek, but he did study Latin, and we know that. C.S. Lewis grew up studying Latin and Greek and translating plays when he was in his early teenage years. So it is part of a tradition that goes back a long ways. So if we're thinking about tradition, that's a good word. Let's just take apart that word for a second. Tradition in Latin means to hand on, to pass on from one person to another. Literally, tradere is the verb to hand on. So it is something that is handed on. And we start with the curriculum and the pedagogy of the Greeks and the Romans. Paul talks about this as well in the scriptures when he references the paideia, this Greek word that kind of summed up the educational program of the Greco-Roman world. Taking that, the church developed this program in the Middle Ages and on, and perfected it, and rooting it in Christ. And the whole point of that education, though, was to cultivate men and women of virtue and piety, wisdom and eloquence. Another way to think of classical education is to think of contemplation. Nowhere in the Roman world or in the medieval world was education seen as just purely a means to an end. You're just going to get a degree so you can just go get a job, so you can just go make money. It was a contemplative endeavor. It was something that was rooted in part of man's being as not just an animal to do stuff, but we are made in the image of God. We have the ability to reflect, to contemplate things, to think about thinking even. So you could think of classical education as being a way to contemplate the good, the true, and the beautiful. These are transcendental qualities of God and part of his attributes and who he is. The good, the true, and the beautiful through the tools of the 7 liberal arts. What are those? Okay, time to unpack it. So let's talk about the 7 liberal arts. There's some debate about this, but basically they divide into 2 sort of categories. The liberal arts that have to do with language and the liberal arts that have to do with number. We call it the trivium and the quadrivium. The trivium is the 3 ways that come together, and the quadrivium, the 4 ways. The ones that have to do with language are probably the ones we're most familiar with: grammar, logic, and rhetoric. The other liberal arts, the 4, music, mathematics, geometry, and astronomy. Those were ways of understanding the world that had to do with proportion and symmetry and number, and seeing the beauty of that proportionality held together with this coherent system of meaning. And often this was the logos, the thing that held it all together, that gave everything meaning in the universe. So back up to the trivium. Our school at St. Abraham's focuses on the trivium: grammar, logic, or dialectic, as it's called, and rhetoric. A writer by the name of Dorothy Sayers noticed that those three liberal arts pair and fit really well with the stages of child development. When they're young, they love to memorize. They love to sing and chant. You'll notice your students are pointing out patterns in grammar. This is why it's called grammar school, because they study how to diagram sentences. They study patterns of sentences, subject nouns, and predicate formations, and that sort of thing. They also study Latin. They study the parts of speech, and they broaden their vocabulary. They love to parrot things at this stage. When they get a little older, it's natural for students to start asking deeper questions and then being a little bit more critical about how things fit together. You said this, but what about this? Anybody who's a parent of a middle school aged student or even a high school student will probably experience this on a daily level, where you said something, Mom, but you also said this, and those things don't line up, right? And they love to point out those kinds of inconsistencies, especially during that time. Well, they're trying to piece their world together, trying to make sense of it. This is why it's an excellent time to study logic. C.S. Lewis in the Chronicles of Narnia talks about how schools stopped teaching logic, and that was one of the great evils in the world at his time, is that schools had neglected teaching the way to measure propositions, and that's what logic does. And the final stage is rhetoric. Rhetoric is that stage where we study beauty, and so if you think about the way in which this all builds together, you have the building blocks of grammar, you have how they fit together, and then you have this final stage of making and creating something beautiful, making it attractive. That's what rhetoric is: how to speak and how to write in a beautiful and persuasive way. And when they are older, as teenagers, they naturally gravitate toward this. So, though that was kind of the fire hose definition of the liberal arts tradition. One of the other ways to just understand classical education is to see it as a coherent view of the world. Most people, I think, have all kinds of contradictions in their head all the time. We actually are teaching at St. Abraham's that you can know things about the world. We're not agnostic. We believe that God has revealed truth, and that you can actually know truth, that there is meaning to life. So we're handing on a gift of a coherent understanding of the world, that all things kind of consist in Christ, and that they are held together by the eternal word of the Father, the Logos, that gives meaning and life to all things, to all subjects and aspects of our life. We study the best that has been written, the great books and the great ideas. We are kind of part of a tradition where this ongoing conversation is happening about what is good and true and beautiful. We read great authors, difficult authors. Jane Austen, Augustine, Edmund Burke, Aquinas, Emily Dickinson, Dostoevsky, Mark Twain, Plato, C.S. Lewis, Aristotle, Chaucer, the author of Beowulf, right? And on and on and on. And what our kids are gaining through all this is wisdom. And this is not just knowledge. This is something bigger than that. It's a moral imagination as well. It's a cultivation of the soul, and and right affections and right desires and good tastes and good habits, a disposition to do the right thing, and the formation of the soul and of the conscience. And I could keep going on and on and on and trying to sell this, but ultimately, I think you'll get the picture. It's hard to talk about it. It's hard to neatly capture it in one simple statement. It's something that I think requires us to continue to look at it from different aspects. I think that's probably the next thing I'll talk about in the next video is sometimes it's helpful to explain things through metaphor. Okay? Well, what are the metaphors that are maybe helpful to understanding classical Christian education? We'll talk about that next time. Thanks.